Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Candace Stewart.
And I'm Marjorie Levinson.
The title of our presentation for you today, and I guess this entire project, is inspired by El Barrio, an interactive event on global water crisis. And we'll definitely be able to explain a little bit more about El Barrio if you're unfamiliar.
And the name of our team is Across the Hudson because mid-year, Miss Stewart actually left us to go across the Hudson to New Jersey. So we're gonna actually bridge the two schools together in this project at the end of the unit. So in case you just need a little background about East Harlem and where we come from, this is actually the school I work at, Dream Charter School. And it is one of the largest predominantly Hispanic communities in New York, typically comprised of a Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican, Salvadorian, and Mexican population. It roughly encompasses the area of north of 96th Street and east of Fifth Avenue to the east and Harlem Rivers. And we are in District 11. It's notable for contributions to music, such as salsa and hip hop. It's a very transient area that attracts specific immigrant groups. Lately, there has been an influx of gentrification and large luxury buildings next to affordable housing developments. In the 1980s and the 1990s, 40% of its residents lived below the poverty line. 40% of the families living there resided in public housing projects, and 40% of Harlem households had no wage or salary income. Voting predominantly takes place in schools, but is skewed by the immigrant population due to documentation status. All problems that our school actually works really hard to address by providing housing, by also providing a lot of culturally relevant education and opportunities for students to partake.
And for where I am, I'm at Columbia High School, which serves, about over 2,000 students from grades 9 through 12. Its minority population is about 49%, the majority being Black of the minority population, and the other, obviously, white. So CHS, it serves two districts, South Orange and Maplewood, and it's a pretty affluent neighborhood. So I'm really interested to see what kinds of conversations come out of, what we're going to make together for this community event in East Harlem.
So one thing we were surprised while doing our research about East Harlem was we were surprised to realize that despite the rich cultural history that the vast immigrant population has brought to East Harlem, such as the music, such as the artistry, they're often not credited with the development of their own community. Much of the history is whitewashed, and the part that we do, I guess, acknowledge is the part that originates from deficits like poverty, drug prevalence, immigration status, etc. And then we kind of skip over the true origins within people's countries of origin. So thinking about where the music comes from, thinking about where like the culture, where the food, where all the amazing things that you can find in East Harlem, and really it's been so whitewashed and so taken over, and the community is not really credited for their own development. So the members of the community obviously celebrate their rich histories and culture within like their families and communities, but the wider landscape of New York kind of looks at it from a deficit approach. And then what we were discussing really heavily is the people credited with the development of the community are not the community members themselves, but rather the government and state, which have only built upon what the community members themselves already created. And I mean, that's not necessarily just an East Harlem issue, that's a New York issue. But just, I feel like it's more prevalent here because truthfully, there is such a rich culture and it's so overlooked in general. And when we get more into talking about El Museo del Barrio, we'll see that more.
So, and getting to learn a little bit more about the history for this presentation was like an honor. El Museo was founded more than 50 years ago by artists and educators Rafael Montañez Ortiz and a coalition of Puerto Rican parents, educators, artists, and activists who noted that mainstream museums largely ignored the Latino artists, which is what Marjorie was talking about. It spans over 800 years of Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino art, and includes pre-Columbian Taino artifacts, traditional arts, 20th century drawings, paintings. I mean, it's amazing. Sculptures, installations, prints, photography, documentary, films, and video. And you'll see that a large part of our community event will be in uplifting the multimodality of all of these experiences for our students, right? Because we want to bridge the gap of past and present and future. So Black and Brown artists are highly celebrated at El Barrio. It's, because of the underrepresentation. El Museo del Barrio, it is a residency program, and it offers like free living spaces for people in the neighborhood who are artists. So you have to be from that area, and you have to be an artist in order to also live in that building too. So it's really cool that there's this connection between art and housing, which you'll learn more about in terms of East Harlem and how East Harlem works and operates.
So our students are from this community. So what we wanted to connect specifically with El Museo del Barrio, because we said that like this can really support and encourage them to carry on the artistic legacy of El Barrio. Actually, when we were going through the process of trying to figure out what we wanted our students to actually produce, we got stuck on graffiti for a minute, because the neighborhood is actually super well known for the amazing graffiti walls. There's a graffiti hall of fame in El Barrio as well. So it was actually really hard to pick, just because there is so much diverse artistry in that community. So being, and again, completely community run and organized, but being exposed to the various types of artists and the types of artwork within the museum can help to expand students' understanding of what actually constitutes art and what art means. And why we chose this particular place is because representation matters. Students can see themselves in the artists, they can recognize their own potential. And then also for our culminating unit project, we're actually going to have students create a museum exhibit, very similar to the inspiration by the Museo del Barrio, using activist art that visually displays different aspects of the global water crisis. And when we say museum exhibit, we are leaving it open-ended intentionally, because we want students to be inspired by the work that they're going to see throughout the unit, but also to be inspired by the work and the various modalities displayed in
global water crisis. And often when we think about the global water crisis, hello? Oh, I think Trevor is on. When we think about the global water crisis, we're often thinking about international issues, but what Marjorie and I plan on doing with our students is also thinking about the issues of water that's also just in the neighborhood and in our areas. So Marjorie, do you mind if you can click the next slide for me, please?
Actually.
Thank you. So our curriculum, right? This is our unit. Students will learn about the global water crisis and its impact on individuals and communities locally, nationally, and globally. They'll be able to understand that humans have impacted the world in negative ways. They'll be able to understand the underlying global issue and the lack of access to clean water and its impact on individuals. They'll be able to understand the global issue of drought and its impact on individuals and societies. They'll be able to analyze multiple perspectives on a major global issue and evaluate the impact depending on individuals' roles in society. They'll be able to understand the problem-solution framework and comprehend that solutions are not entirely effective. They'll be able to assess benefits and liabilities of potential solutions and their impact. And ultimately, at the end, they'll be able to create a museum presentation in which they creatively amplify an issue and a solution within the global water crisis.
And again, just to speak to what Candace just discussed, we want to leave it really open-ended. We want, our inventors to be able to build a new dam or build a new solution and have like those materials readily available for them to do so and think through it. And part of what we were discussing is like, we're not actually grading their artwork, we're grading the thought process behind it. And that was something we wanted to be very clear on, is that we're evaluating like the artist statement and the message and the purpose and all these planning pieces we have in place rather than how well their thing works. Because the truth is, right, we have engineers building dams that don't work. So we don't expect our students to necessarily be able to entirely solve the issue with, you know, some hydraulic pumps. That is not something we've considered yet, Sonia, but that is something that we could definitely consider. I think right now, to be fully transparent, like the unit is very dense because we are looking at it from both from a local, national, and global level. So just in terms of like timing, it's a very, very dense and I would say filled out unit. But I would definitely say like that is something that in another unit we could definitely tie back into this unit. Yeah, and that was what we were very concerned about as well, Jessica. Like this idea of kids like never want to do something if they know that they can't do it right. So like I think this idea of like not having any wrong answers, like you can't be wrong. The only thing, like I said, that we would really be, you know, pushing students towards is thinking about their message. We talked about activist art a lot. Candace and I actually kind of came up with our own definition of this weird term, evidence-based artwork. And basically, I'm very humanities oriented, and Candace is more of art, so she pushes my thinking towards the art side sometimes. And something we came up with was this idea of evidence-based art, where if you can prove your message through whatever your modality is, then you've done your job. If your message is conveyed, if your message is clear and your subject is clear, then you know that's what we're asking for. So in terms of so this is actually something that our school asks us to include on our lesson plans, and it basically asks us to connect the student to the content. So we have identities. How will your teachings help students to learn something about themselves or others? So this teaching will help students to learn about the issue that people in other countries face regarding lack of access to clean drinking water and those issues of effect on health and wellness. But again, not just globally, we're also looking at nationally and locally. In terms of skills, students are learning to think in a problem solution framework. They're learning to evaluate pros and cons of a solution, because in a lot of the articles we're reading, we're going to learn why a lot of the solutions don't work. They're going to use something known as a global analysis graphic organizer to deeply understand and analyze the impact of global issues on individuals and their own communities. So again, we're going to kind of start with a broader lens and then slowly narrow it inward to ourselves. Students will also learn to identify in terms of literacy, the author's point of view and its impact on the understanding of the article. And then lastly, students will learn how to visually display various aspects of the global water crisis by developing a theme and message for their artwork, meaning like what do they want the reader or the viewer to walk away with. In terms of intellect, they ask what will our students become smarter about, or what will they walk away knowing? So students will be able to think more critically regarding potential solutions to problems rather than just accepting them as permanent and entirely beneficial. In one particular video that I know we're going to watch in the unit, they actually talk about how one of the dams, I don't remember exactly where it was, but there was one dam that actually created a lot of problems for people in California, and the farmers were struggling badly because their land was actually unfarmable at some points because it had been so irrigated and so oversaturated with the reservoir, because the reservoir was actually taking water. So just thinking about how that impacted the farmers and the crops and the people's access to food and all those other variables. In terms of criticality, our school asked us how we're going to engage in that thinking about power, equity, and anti-oppression in the tech society and the world. So really forcing us to, you know, use those culturally relevant framework to think about how are we actually doing this? How are we actually making sure that it does connect back to this issue of power and equity? So we're going to be examining equity and power as we look into which specific communities and countries have consistent access to clean water and which countries or societies don't. And so in doing this, we're going to examine how power and control can impact one's access to resources essential to survival. In a particular part of the unit, I know we're going to be talking about how in a lot of countries, women and children are the ones responsible for going with the buckets miles and miles, which is dangerous because they're walking through forests and woods. There are animals, there are thieves, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one variable. But then also when they're carrying these buckets, because the walk can take up to 8 hours, the children aren't going to school. The women aren't being permitted to work. So all of that obviously limits access in terms of domestic violence, in terms of all these other things where they don't have a way out, because it feeds the cycle of poverty when children are not permitted to go to school because they have to go get this water, because they want, their parents need somebody to help them carry it. So just in terms of like on a more global level, that's what we're looking at. And then in terms of more locally and nationally, we're going to be looking at our own communities and which communities, based on sewage lines, based on things like that, have cleaner water and why.
We're going to do this with 4 essential questions. How does lack of access to clean water impact both individuals and societies? How does drought contribute to this? Why are certain communities disproportionately affected by the global water crisis? What are the best solutions available for helping to solve this crisis? And what are some potential pitfalls with these solutions? What is the impact? How can you be involved as an activist in your own community through art interventions? Yeah, and honestly, a lot of these essential questions is to speak to what Marjorie just said. They're going to be learning a lot of, they're going to be doing a lot of research, a lot of open-ended discussions to get them thinking about what the problem is and their possible solutions. And to, of course, I believe to Jessica's point, they're allowed to make mistakes. We're going to have to be critical in our way of thinking of how to come up with these solutions and how to just be honest with each other, be honest with the process. So I'm excited to get, go ahead, Marjorie.
I think the articles are where they have their guidance around like where to start, because the art, right, we know dams are a great solution, but they don't always work. And like using that framework of what a dam is and what a dam does from like a more, I would say, engineering perspective, because we have a video of how they're built and how they're made, and then using that kind of solution, but it's not permanent, as a way to guide their own thinking. So like, okay, I noticed that the water collects up here, but it actually doesn't get enough down here because it's taking from the soil. How could we, and really having students say, well, so the problem is that the water needs to get down to the ground as well. How can we add that into a design that's already made? Because I think what's really also important for students to understand is that you're not reinventing the wheel. Nobody ever reinvents the wheel. It's also part of creativity is also taking the materials that you're being provided with and taking the opportunities that you're being provided with and taking the things that have already been done and reworking them to just be better. And I think students often confuse creativity with like creating something completely new, and that's not all creativity is. So just in terms of our lesson breakdown, there are about 27 lessons in this unit. So each one is just a learning target for that lesson, because we do have the curriculum, but we wanted to spare you in its entire form. But just for lesson 1, students, so the unit that this topic addresses is specifically about survival. So we're starting from a survival standpoint. So in the first lesson, students will be able to understand that there are 5 basic needs, and they have to analyze which factors impact human survival most strongly. So like, is it food? Is it water? Like, what do we need the most? Hopefully they'll get to, something around water and food, which will launch us into our lesson 2. They're going to watch the omnibus roundup to understand local water supply and the various factors that impact it. They'll be able to identify and explain the various perspectives expressed throughout the video. In lesson 3, students will be able to watch the water underground to understand and explain cause and effect and identify how local water supply is negatively impacted by urban infrastructure. In lesson 4, they're going to understand the issue of the globe. So again, we're starting locally, we're going out, and then we're coming back in. It's kind of like we're keeping it connected to them at first so they stay interested, and then we're kind of taking a broader lens, and then we're going to narrow back in for the project. Students will be able to watch sorry, students will be able to understand for lesson 4 the issue of the global water crisis and impact on a variety of people. And then in lesson 5, we'll be able to understand factors contributing to the global water crisis.
Yeah, for lesson 6, they'll be reading and annotating secondary sources to explore the impact of a global crisis on different groups. They'll read and interpret data to determine the effect of a global crisis on different countries and assess how the country's status plays a role in access. They'll identify and understand the global issue of drought and the history behind it. They'll use an analytical tool to examine some potential solutions to the global issue of drought and problems that each of these solutions may pose. And then for lesson 10, they'll brainstorm and plan a creative writing piece that demonstrates an understanding of the global crisis of drought and its impact on individuals.
So for lesson 10, we're asking students to step into the shoes of somebody experiencing a drought or some type of element of the global water crisis and just kind of really understand. Sorry, I think for middle schoolers, it can sometimes be very hard to step out of who you are and step into someone else's shoes. And like this creative writing assignment would kind of force them to look at it through the lens of somebody experiencing it as opposed to an outsider. I think it's really hard to connect with something when you're an outsider, when you think it doesn't affect you. But when you're being forced to step into that person's shoes, I think it's a lot stronger and easier to connect to. So in lesson 11, students will be editing and revising that creative writing piece. We don't do a lot of creative writing in our school, so that was definitely something we wanted to incorporate because that is also a form of artistry. In lesson 12, students are going to examine the 10 visual artworks, so completed for the charity WaterAid. So after the UN declared a global water crisis about 10 years ago, there were 10 artworks commissioned. Totally different modalities, and they were commissioned to commemorate the annual anniversary. Sorry, I'm a little under the weather. And so we're gonna actually have students kind of individually analyze each artwork, and it's going to start with just basic observations because that's the easiest way to engage all students, just thinking about universal design. That's one thing I've learned, like in social studies specifically. I always start with what do you see, because any student at any level can answer that. And then going into those deeper level questions like, what do you think the author's message is? What did you think he wanted people to learn from this artwork? What do you think he wanted people, or she wanted people to understand from this artwork? And then for lesson 13, we're looking at, we're going to be reading an article to understand one potential solution to the drought and their impact on survival. We're going to look at different perspectives on the topic of dams.
Yeah,
that's a very good question, and that's what we're kind of figuring out between us.
Yeah, the interesting part about looping in middle schoolers and high schoolers is that we kind of want to have some sort of mentorship happening. So a lot of my high schoolers who are mostly going to be doing art and inventing with me, they're going to be kind of mentoring, hopefully at points in times, the middle schoolers on how to, on what they've learned from their process, right? What mistakes have they gone through? And then, the lessons that Marjorie is reviewing right now is a lot of the thinking, because we want them to walk away knowing that this is an issue that's very much real, that very much affects every single person. And the social justice, the civic of all of this is really important. And you can use art as a way of taking on that issue. You can use art as a way of trying to figure out how to express, how to understand, how to examine, of course. But ultimately, what do we want our students to have within their bodies so that when they leave us, when they graduate, like today, they're going to move forward with a passion that they can continue to, follow up with.
And I think also just, introducing, I think something we discussed is that we're going to introduce the idea of the project from the beginning. So in each lesson, students are going to be encouraged, like, think about how this relates to your message. Think about how this relates to what you're going to do at the end. Like, so there's always going to be that reminder, like, this is coming up. You should be thinking about your final piece and what part, I think, because also part of what we want students to realize is they can't analyze the whole water crisis in their artwork, right? They can't analyze the global aspects, the local aspects, the national aspects, the problems, the solutions, right? There's just too much. The inequity, the power, it's too broad, it's too much. And like kids also, I noticed like my middle schoolers, they have a hard time figuring out like how much to bite off. So I think like through this process, it's also that idea of narrowing it down. Like this is a really big issue. This is a big issue, not just in our communities, but everywhere. How can I pick which bite-sized piece I want to attack in my artwork or in my presentation or in my brochure? What am I biting off for me? And I think that's also where like that personal statement comes in. What part of this affected you the most? What part of this stuck out to you the most? And you know, you might have your kid who says nothing stuck out to me, and then that's guidance, right? That's asking those clarifying questions. That's asking, you know, students to dig a little deeper. What was something that was super impactful for you to learn about? What was something that, you know, maybe relates to your family, and really guiding students without doing the thinking for them, because a lot of my middle schoolers, I will say, look for the answer. And so I think not having an answer to look for it, because I can literally say, I don't know. I don't know what stuck out to you. I don't know what impacted you the most. I know that these are the, you know, and of course, having that scaffolding for students with needs, right? Having the options, like this is one issue, this is a second issue, you can do this, you can do that. I think like having, you know, 10 or so big topics that they can address, sure. But in terms of narrowing down which one is impactful to the student, that's an individual choice. And I think that's something that's going to be heavily stressed, sorry, is going to be, this is personal, I can't decide for you, because I think that that's where we're going to get, you know, that really strong artistry is when it matters to them. I can't tell you what to care about.
You know,
Yeah.
Just because I was also reading Jessica and Sonia's and Rochelle's points that are in the chat, the opportunity that's on the table right now for doing this is really purposeful. And like true social justice, it comes with some sort of action, right? An action step. There's tons of units, you know, across the year where students are making art. They're making art that's very self-serving. And what's on the table right now is something that's not very self-serving. It's serving the community. So we want them to do it from a place where they're really critical about their own thinking and about themselves and their own understanding of what the issue is. So that's why a lot of it is like, for this unit, we're gonna go in it and we're gonna research and we're gonna do evidence-based art, you know? But go ahead, Marjorie, you can.
No, absolutely. And I think that ties back into that idea of what evidence-based art really means. You can't produce without having the research and the content behind it. And I think that's kind of where we got that. we coined that term. Something else we're looking at is also the different perspectives. Just this idea of the fact that, you know, everybody with a stake in this has a different perspective on the issue. Farmers have one perspective, the engineers have another perspective, the community has another perspective, the government has another perspective, the state government has another perspective. And I think just understanding that all these parts somehow have to work together and just make it work. And so then lastly, we also want to, again, really fuel discussion, because part of, you know, the thinking process is just being able to discuss and analyze these issues. So for the less than 15 students are going to outline an argument using textual evidence to determine whether dams are a good solution to drought, because they will have the article presenting them as a positive and they will have the article presenting them as a negative in terms of liabilities. And so having students being presented with both of those pieces of information and then kind of leading them. My students love to debate. I will tell you, they love those debates, and they don't realize half the time that they're writing an essay when they're debating, because I make them have a claim and 3 reasons and a piece of evidence for each reason. So it's secretly an essay and nobody knows, and it's amazing, because the rule is you can't participate if you don't come prepared. So everybody, no matter what level, will come prepared with an argument, which is an essay, but we don't tell them. It's a persuasive essay, and we don't tell them, and we get away with it. So just also pushing towards that as well.
So I love that. Students will be able to participate in debate, which you just spoke about. I feel like you just went over all of this, though, didn't you?
Mm.
They'll participate in the debate and completed debate reflection. They'll be able to understand what activism is and the various methods of activism by playing Beautiful Trouble. I'm jealous because Marjorie got the cards and she was able to, like, you know, do it with her students. But it's okay. I'll do it.
The debate ones were a hit. I will say the debate ones were a big hit.
And I'm sure that Rachel and Sarah will follow up with you all about what Beautiful Trouble is. Students will be able to develop at least 5 research questions to help them identify resources people can reach out to locally and globally to aid in the issues caused by the global water crisis. They'll be able to identify at least 3 resources where people can reach out for support to aid the global water crisis, both globally and locally. And ultimately, at the end, they'll be able to plan and brainstorm their final museum project by identifying a specific topic, a portion of the issue that will be focused, the medium, the type of project, what they're going to create, and the message that they're going to convey.
So just with regard to lesson 18 and 19, in case you were wondering like why those lessons are there, part of the ending and the final museum tour is going to involve a brochure, because part of activism is also what are we doing, not just what are we displaying and how are we educating people, because educating people is a do, right? It's an action step. But we also wanted to give people like resources. Okay, so you know, what are we doing about this now? So something we wanted to have students do is really do the work behind it and finding those resources, finding where people, where their parents, where their cousins, where their community members can reach out to. So that is something that we're, you know, if there are also going to be a group of students working on a brochure for the museum, we have some students who maybe aren't as artistic or who prefer to work on the computer, prefer the graphic design.
Everybody is artistic.
Yes,
Marjorie.
I know.
Worked on this.
We worked on this, I know. Yes. So, but yes, we definitely have our graphic design portions. So they will be working more towards the brochure aspect that we're giving out at the door, kind of just like a real museum, and really bringing that museum aspect to life. So that just explains lesson 18 and 19 a little more clearly. And then, yeah, so 20 is really just the planning. And this is where like we want them to do their strongest thinking. This is really like lesson 20 and I think the final lesson for us are the most important. What is your thought process? What are you trying to do? Whether or not it happens, what are you trying to do and what is your intentionality behind it? And I think like this is kind of where we would give them feedback. You know, maybe that topic's a little broad. How could you narrow that? How could you make your subject a little more clear? How could you make your message a little more clear? So this is really a feedback step. It's allowing us to check in with where they're at, what they want to do, and then kind of guiding them towards maybe potentially narrowing it, potentially finding a different method of display, whatever. So in lesson 21, students will really work on developing their theme and topic. So after they wrote their kind of brainstorming outline, now this is where they're writing a proposal. What do you want to do and why? Where is your very clear artist statement? It's not an artist statement yet. That's going to be in the final lesson, but where are you going? Lesson 22 through 26, and this is very tentative because technically they'll be creating throughout, and this will be heavily encouraged that they are creating throughout the process. This is just kind of like in the final weeks, this is what's happening. So this is where they're actually drafting and creating the project that portrays their theme, and they're exploring all the different materials. So at this point, you know, students would have already decided, okay, I'm working on a solution, or I'm working on displaying, you know, the people disproportionately affected. I want to show the impact on children specifically. And I'm doing a painting to show the impact on children. And my message is that kids are missing education because they're being forced to carry water instead of being able to go to school. So thinking about how can I display that visually? How can I use my painting to display that? So all that thinking is going to go in there. And then lastly, our final lesson would be an artist statement. So students would write an artist statement that explains how their project or invention accurately depicts their theme. They can also explain the purpose of their artwork. In this artist statement, they can also feel free to explain something that worked or didn't work. That is something I definitely learned from Candace. She always has her students reflect on their process. That's also something we as adults consistently do. So encouraging students to really sit back and reflect on their process and I don't know if my artwork accurately portrays that. What do you guys think? And I think, having that feedback and saying, I think your subject's really strong. There's definitely a clear child at the forefront of your painting. But, I was a little confused about, hypothetically speaking, the water droplets in the background and how it related, because it kind of looks like he's stuck in the rain. And I think, forcing kids to really give each other that constructive feedback is also part of the learning experience.
And if you're freaking out about 4 days to make art, that's obviously going to be problematic for certain students and for the certain things that they want to do. So we definitely have that, in the back of our minds. You'll start to hear within the first 2 weeks or so of what they want to make. And then some might have to, come after school or get some parent help or some additional help earlier on to finish on time. So student outcomes, ultimately foundational art activists in the making, obviously, right? Community awareness, community investment, understanding that access to water is not an independent variable, and understanding the intersectionality of various institutions, understanding the impact of interactions between humans and natural resources, and also understanding that not all solutions to a problem are finite, which I think you see as a theme in our presentation.
So how will we know we've met our outcomes? Student interest in societal issues and engagement after the event. So having students, engage with their families in conversations at dinner, having students say, my mom really liked the presentation, she wants to learn more. Little things like that will definitely let us know that students are now invested, and also just asking questions about other issues. This year, after I taught a similar unit, students definitely came up and wanted to talk about any social issue that they read about in the news. So it kind of like our advisory lessons turned into social justice sessions, which was quite interesting for the students who were a little less involved. But they definitely, I would say that that's also where student discourse came into the picture and forced kids to really engage in these deep level social justice conversations. We'll know that students have created visually pleasing and resourceful tools that the community can use. Families and community members share the impact of the event with one another as well as ourselves. Students articulate the issues of the water crisis, human rights, and necessity versus capital gain. We're also looking at student articulation through written expression as well as art inventions. And students share their reflective process and illustrate alternatives, especially for failed experimentation. So one of the questions Candace always asks her students is, what would you do differently next time? And like I said, failed projects are totally fine. We are grading them, we are accepting them. It's really about that artist statement. It's really about that planning stage more so than the actual product. So really asking students to reflect on, hey, this didn't work. What could you have done differently? What could you have done better? What would you change to make it clearer? In the case of the hypothetical painting we discussed, just really forcing students to reflect and understand that, like, even if you have, what seems to be a perfect painting or a perfect project or a perfect solution, when you do get that, constructive feedback, what are you doing with it? Are you saying, no, my project's perfect and I'm perfect and I'm amazing? Or are you saying, hey, you know what, that's actually a great contribution. Maybe I wouldn't put it in this painting, but maybe I'd continue my work onto this painting. And I think, all of that is part of understanding the process.
All right, so student outputs. Kids can do water conservation posters, awareness pamphlets, alternative water inventions, artistic displays of the impact, interviews with community leaders and trying to find the liaisons. No problem. Artistic dispositions. Marjorie brought up the starfish story, which I love, and I think that students will find really genuine. It mattered to that one person. We're talking about action at the end of social justice, doing this work. If it impacts one person, if one person's heart changes, one person's situation evolves, and one person's mind evolves, that is what matters. So we want them to have that disposition moving forward. Future problem solvers, of course, that's the theme. And purposeful art, evidence-based artwork, right? That we are about trying to find the best approaches and the execution to communicate that message. We need to have a theme. or we need to have a concept. We need to have a clear idea of what we're trying to do with our work, especially if we want change to come at the end of it.
And I think the starfish story, just because that's close to my heart personally, I think where that really stemmed from with me is I get a lot of the time when we do these kinds of units in social studies, I get, well, we can't fix the issue, so why are we learning about it? Like, we can't fix it. We can fix it. Yeah, maybe I can turn off my sink, but what about the 300,000 other people in New York or in my neighborhood who aren't turning off their sink? And I think that's really where that story comes in. And yes, I plan to do some type of read aloud in either part of the curriculum. If you're not familiar with the starfish story, the quick synopsis is a guy's picking up starfish on the beach. He tosses them back into the ocean one at a time. A little kid comes up to him and says, "Why are you tossing them into the ocean? You can't save them all." And he said, "Well, it mattered to that one." That's the really short SparkNotes version. So just using that kind of as a guide to help students understand why it is so important, even if we can't change the world, why it's important to change what we're in control of.
It was a super fast story. And that's us. Yeah, if you didn't know, I'm the art teacher. She's the humanities one. And those are our email addresses and where we reside. So definitely reach out to us if you want to follow up and have a deeper conversation.